Welcome back to One on One with Mr. U. Of course, I'm your host, Mr. U. In studio with us, U.S. Navy veteran, modern day preacher, comedian, author, Mr. Whiskey's in the house. Good morning, sir. How are you, brother?
I'm doing great, and like you said, as they call you Mr. U, they call me Mr. Whiskey. So here we are together, and I'm ready for it.
I love it. I love it. Just for all our folks listening and viewing today, I don't know what's going on, but since late last week, our platform's been having some technical issues. I'm starting to hear some of them now already, so bear with us. We're going to always go through the end of the episode as far as we can go. Issues or difficulties, notwithstanding, we're going to keep on putting the work in. So, customarily, I always ask our guests to come through with our very first question that I ask. Describe your upbringing in your childhood. Usually, it's pretty smooth, but in some cases, I think maybe like yours, the childhood is not as clean as we hear in some other episodes. So if you're open to that, go ahead and share your childhood, your upbringing. We'd love to hear about you, man. So go ahead.
For sure, like you said, it wasn't so smooth. Again, what I always put out is there are worse childhoods out there than mine, but there are different ways childhoods can be bad, right? There is, physical abuse and domestic violence. There is emotional warfare, spiritual warfare, and it all affects people in different ways. A lot of times in permanent, traumatizing ways. Mine was a household of conformity and controlling. And luckily, I broke free from that. And I'm an entrepreneur. I'm very independent thinking. But there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who grew up in similar households who are still under the control and influence of their parents in a more than parenting way. There's a certain level of control you're supposed to have as a parent, right? That's how you discipline and nurture and raise. But there is overprotective. I wasn't allowed to use the stove because it was considered too dangerous. I wasn't allowed to really go out. My father was a police officer for 25 years, and I understand his fear. He saw some of the worst things. I mean, I've had doctors and first responders on my show, and they said that their days run on your worst days. So I do take that into consideration with what my father was protecting us from, because he responded to some gruesome things. I've talked to a lot of first responders and people who work in prisons, and the atrocities that some people commit are grotesque. They are inhumane. And but he was kind of, scared of that to some degree. And then him and my mom also, their upbringings weren't the best either, to some degree. And so I think that was influential into how they raised me and my sisters. And so very controlling. I only ever snuck out of the house one time to see a girl, as young men do. And my dad came out in a cop car after me. So talk about, not wanting to leave the house again. That was bad, but and not really worth it, because she friend zoned me afterward. But unfortunately, the thing is that there was also religious weaponization from my father's end, very twisted religious views on his end. My mom kind of took the back seat because I found out later on that there had been domestic violence. So she had fear, and my dad had control over her. He had broken half of her face is made out of metal plates, because he had broken her skull their first night of their honeymoon, or one of the nights. And so a lot of this I didn't find out till later on in life. But between my father's alcoholism, the religious weaponization, the controlling, the fighting between him and my mother, witnessing that every day, never really physical, except for that incident before my birth, but a lot of yelling, cursing, screaming. There was hints of, and later on confirmed, of sexual abuse towards my mother, possibly to the degree of my youngest sister being her birth being forced into my mother, if you're tracking what I'm saying. So a lot of terrible stuff there. And, even their whole, everything was just very messy. And they kind of planned our lives for us, right? That's how I ended up in the military. How both my youngest sisters, who I never, ever, ever would have seen going into the military, also ended up there, though they claim my mother had no influence in that. And so to kind of summarize how it affected me ultimately was that I grew up antisocial, an outcast. I remember the first day I went to public school, because I had gone to a corrupt private Catholic school. very first friend I made, I went home excited. I was like, Dad, Mom, I made friends and they invited me to hang out. And like public school wasn't this horrible, terrible place. Because my father, he made public school seem terrible, like it was
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
awful fiery pit. And my dad said, no, you're not allowed to hang out with those people. I arrested one of their parents, or this kid did that. And so he kind of picked and chose my friends for me, which was awful because I believe, in fact, what the Bible calls us to believe and practice is that the sins of our parents, are not our sins as their children, nor are our sins as children the sins of our parents, right? Each person is responsible for their own being and what they do. And so my father, I understand what he was trying to protect me from, because he had interacted with their parents, and I'm sure it was reflected into their household. But because of that, and I didn't know how to explain that,
Sure.
I ended up becoming enemies with all these people who were supposed to be my friends. And so I spent a lot of time
Oh,
outcasted. A lot of people hated me just for being the son of a police officer. And this was back before all the movements against police officers even started. I mean, people had just not liked them from the beginning of time, right? And so
feels that
that
way.
yeah, and then I didn't really have a lot of relatives, like big family gatherings. My mom and dad didn't really have friends. And so I grew up very outcasted and isolated. And I really thank God for giving me such a intellectual curiosity, and setting me up with people later on in the military and post-military, especially through the podcasting industry, who allowed me to develop into a person like what we're doing right now. I would have never been able to do as a child. I would have never talked
Makes
to
sense.
certain people, or especially to people I've never really met, right? And now every day for hours, I talk to people across the globe, online, through my show, through other shows, and at in-person events. And I even travel alone to other countries, to different states, doing all this entrepreneurial work that is
Oh
just
wow.
completely opposite of who I was. And like I said, not everyone turns out that way, and I'm very thankful for all the support I've had to help that happen.
No, thank you for sharing that, man. That's a powerful story. That runs pretty deep. I wish we had more time to dig into it. I will
Yeah.
ask you one question though. I didn't really plan to ask this, but because of what you shared, it kind of got me thinking a little bit. Sometimes when people have rough upbringings, my present company included, one thing we always vow that we're never going to be like blank. When we grow up, we're never going to be like blank. Whenever we become parents, we're never going to be like blank. Tell me, if you can put a cap on this, what do you do to ensure, if you can, maybe it's not possible, we'll find out today, but what do you do to ensure that you don't turn out like the things that you're growing up seeing?
Right. So yeah, there's actually studies about this, about are you destined to become your father or mother? And I've researched some of them. It's pretty interesting. And, one of my biggest fears was always ending up like my dad. And there are some great aspects to him, don't get me wrong. But there's also a lot of terrible stuff that we don't have time to cover that, I definitely never want to be a part of my life. And sometimes when I catch myself saying, I'm just like my dad, it's like, it's terrifying. And I remember I asked a petty officer in the Navy when I was serving, I said, you have daughters, and I want to be a father really badly. And like, I was asking him about, like, I'm terrified of becoming just like my father, this and that. And he said, Mr. Whiskey, the fact that you are already thinking about it, you're already one step further than he was, right? Because most likely my father, because he was very different than my grandfather, whom I didn't really meet, but based on what I've heard, so just like you said, the fact that we're already thinking about how do we prevent this or stop this, that means we're already proactively taking those first subconscious and conscious steps on avoiding it. Now, obviously, there's action and plans that we have to do. I would say the biggest thing is, like you said, is it even possible? I would say, well, the number one way to help keep it in check, whether it is possible or not, is accountability. So recognizing when you are behaving like your parents and immediately taking accountability for that. So if you ever end up making a mistake or parenting in a way that isn't in alignment with who you want to be, I would put forward accountability, right? As long as you can recognize it or set up people in your life to help you recognize it. Because that's one of the biggest things too, is, sometimes we don't see it. And when I had an ex-girlfriend say, Mr. Whiskey, You kind of remind me of your dad right now. That was like, wow, I couldn't see it because I was in it, but you saw it. So having, like I have some military buddies of mine who, they know about my father and mother's story. And anytime I'm in a relationship that they think is reflective of that, because again, we've discussed on my show, a lot of traumatic upbringings result in traumatic relationships in the future because you end up mirroring what your father or mother did one way or the other. I ended up, ironically, sometimes I play the role of my father, but sometimes, a lot of times, I've ended up being like my mother, being in a relationship with someone where I don't set boundaries properly, where I am a pushover, where I constantly try to save them. And I've tried to step back into my own person and recognize, all right, what are these traits that my mother had? What are these traits that my father had? And how do I not have them? And luckily, I've worked, through my show, I've got to speak with a lot of relationship and parenting coaches. I think that's another thing. When you grow up in a traumatic household, what you've learned is just from your parents. So going out and reading books and listening to podcasts like this, and learning. And for me, one of the biggest things is going to be the Bible is my guideline for life. So what does that say on parenting? Where did my parents not follow it, and where did they follow it that was successful? And then again, I listen to a lot of podcasts run by moms. You're also teachers, because I find those to be the most insightful, because not only have they raised their own children, but they teach other people's children's, and they have the perspective of what they like about other teachers for their kids and what they don't, their journey as a mom, their journey as a teacher. So I find podcasts like that, or fathers who are also teachers, I find those very, very informative. And then again, just some of the experts I've worked with on my show, whom I'm sure you've also been in contact with. So I think constantly learning and educating yourself, and then accountability. So education and accountability, to summarize, those two things are the most important parts. And then even if your parents are willing, if you have that kind of relationship with your parents, which I don't think I could ever ask my parents this, but where do you think you went wrong as a parent with me? That can be a very interesting
Yeah, not
conversation. That
not
can be a
not not
podcast
great,
on its
not great,
own.
not great for Thanksgiving dinner table.
I was gonna say that can be a very reflective conversation. Depends on,
That
the
can go a lot of
relationship with
ways.
the parents. Yeah. Maybe you want to ask your aunts and uncles, like, when you were raising my cousins, where do you think you went wrong? Maybe have a step removed.
Not even sure if that wouldn't work either. But I want to get a little bit into your military career. You had some amazing things that you experienced during that time, and then I want to get into your awesome show, a couple of nukes. So we got a lot to cover. I want to try to move us along. I got a lot of questions for you. So hopefully we can get as many of these questions in, because I want our viewers and listeners, and your viewers and listeners, to kind of hear more about you and this stuff. So when you already mentioned that in your military career, well, before your military career started, it was kind of influenced by your parents and what they wanted. Okay, totally understand there. Tell me what you would say is the most shocking aspect of the military culture that you've experienced during your time in the military.
That's definitely a good question. And I would say the military wasn't at all like what I expected. So I'd like to say all of it was shocking. There are certain things that you
Okay.
kind of expect. And I would say the biggest thing, though, if I had to focus on one thing, is the difference between what you see in the ads in the movies compared to what life was like. So at least for the Navy, I can't speak for Army and Marines. I think it's a little different. But for Navy specifically, growing up watching war movies, World War II, Vietnam, watching even just those military comedies and seeing the ads, it's a lot of action focused, right? So when I went to boot camp, when I was expecting, like, I would say boot camp was the most shocking part, specifically, but also the rest of it. I expected such a more physically demanding occupation. Again, Army Marines, from what I've heard interviewing them on my show, sounds like you had that. With the Navy, at least in my particular case, and the standards have lowered each year to combat the retention and recruiting crisis. We've seen the standards continually lower.
That's clear.
I was expecting to crawl through mud and barbed wire, climb ropes, like all that army training stuff you see in the movies. And
Yeah.
instead I was in this, air conditioned compartment, you know, doing basic stuff. I remember at some point when I was leaving, it was if you were in your 20s as a female, you only had to do, I believe, between 10 and 17 push-ups. As a male, 20 plus, you only had to do like between 30 and 40, maybe max of 50. And so seeing those standards lowered so much, like I was expecting to like be like, and again, Navy SEALs, they have their physical standards set, right? The Army, Marines, from what I've heard, they have it set. But the Navy, I was just shocked. And I get it in the sense of, you're mostly operating vehicles, right?
Right.
Boats, ships, submarines, and you're mostly in the buildings, right? You're not necessarily out in the field. So I get it. But I do think all across the standard needs to be raised. And, even if that meant I would have struggled through boot camp, I would have appreciated that more, me personally, than going there and feeling like this is a joke. So that was the most shocking thing, was the physical fitness standards, just being so low and so simple. I mean, your physical fitness exam is push-ups, plank, run nowadays. That's it. And it's the plank had been lowered down to such a low time because no one could do it, which they replaced instead of crunches and sit-ups for I believe it was longevity health reasons, because studies had showed that sit-ups or crunches weren't necessarily good for your spine long term. But just the plank was a minute, maybe 2 minutes, 50 seconds, 3 minutes, and that was nothing. So that was the most shocking part. And then how much like schooling it was, like reading books about naval history, about ranking recognition, about your job. Like it is schooling, schooling, like it was it was more like college than the military based on my expectations. And again, when you watch the join the Navy ads on TV, they show people in fighter jets and doing swimming training and running and all this hoo-yah, like, physical, like we're getting ready for war. And I felt like that was really lacking. And then, of course, my boot camp experience was one of only a few people who have gone through what I went through, because it was at the very beginning of COVID and everything was just in chaos. Every day the military was changing how they did things with COVID, just as the civilian world was.
Yeah, without
So
question.
my military experience was also just very unique in that sense. But I think even without the COVID restrictions, we would have had about the same level experience. And so that was the most shocking thing, right? Everything else you kind of expect. The leadership expectations were kind of there. The the normalization of addiction and excessive drinking, this and that, all that more negative stuff you kind of hear about from veterans or from people in the military, or it's kind of just expected. But the physical fitness standards were, I hate to say disappointing, because most people were glad for them. They were like, oh heck yeah, this is nice, this is cushy. But for me, it's like, if we're going to be in the military and we're going to be, quote, the best of the best, like I expect that standard. I think that despite the declining retention and recruiting, they should stop lowering the education standards, stop lowering the military bearing standards, stop lowering the physical fitness standards. They're combating a lack of people staying in and joining by lowering the standards and just filling the military up with more people, but lower quality people, respectfully, where we should continue to keep high quality military members and set up the lifestyle and the leadership and the career expectations and how they are implemented so that people actually want to stay in and join. It's not a matter of are people meeting the standards, it's that the standard of living is not meeting what needs to be met. And so now we have lower and lower quality people joining, which is going to lead to further downhill, those people who are then in charge making it worse for other people coming in. So that was the most shocking part for me.
Okay. We only got time for a few more questions. You see two, try to get them in. So why'd you start a couple of nukes?
Yeah, so for sure, that's a great question. That's a whole episode on its own. So I'll try to speed through this, which is we were sitting around as a couple of nukes. So nuke is a term for obviously the weapon of mass destruction, but it's also what you call a nuclear operator in the Navy. We call each other nukes, right? It's shorthand,
Okay.
it's easy to say. So we're called nukes. And so we were sitting around and I was like, and we were having such an interesting, in-depth conversation. So only about and these numbers are skewed and change all the time. But at the time when I was a nuclear operator, this is what they told us: only about 5 to 8% of all Americans can actually qualify to join the military at that time. Of that 5 to 8%, only about 1% can be nuclear operators. Of that 1% of nuclear operators, only about 1% of them make it through the whole program, maybe between 1 and 5%. The rest either commit suicide or drop out of the military or change rates. We had about 1 to 3 suicides a month, or 1 to 3 attempts a month at minimum. And so it was a
What were you
high
doing?
rate. That was just just a nuclear schooling program, learning.
They were
But
committing suicide because of what they were learning in the school.
right, so it's about, they describe it as drinking water from a fire hose. That is the pacing of the school. It is America's most rigorous academic program, made in partnership with MIT. It is one of the most stressful and difficult education programs you can go through. And again, the rate of people that I started with in A school, power school prototype, to who left out to the fleet, I would say from my power school class of maybe 32 people, only about 5 actually ended up moving on to prototype and submarine training. And from that, only a smaller handful made it to the fleet. And then of those people in the fleet, only about 1 or 2 are still in. And that's originally going with hundreds of people start in A school, and power school, you're broken up to classes. And so, yeah, it's just, I never understood
Why?
it. I understand that it's very stressful, but to the point of suicide, I would say there are a lot of alternatives you can discuss beforehand about trying to change rates, or about, leaving the military before going to that point. But it's more than a school. It's your lifestyle. It is your life. It's 9 hours of classes Monday through Friday, plus mandatory study hours, typically between 2 and 5 hours a day after class and on weekends. It kind of takes over your life, and it can be very stressful. And the more you fail at it, the more time you have to spend doing it, and it ends up just taking over people's lives to the point that they see suicide as the only way out. That, as far as I understand it, I haven't really asked anyone how I pushed them that far, but I have actually stopped and dealt with some shipmates who were suicidal. And it's not just the school. While that's the main aspect, you have to think you also have military aspects on top of it. Wearing the uniform, marching, mustering. You've got people, your instructors are military people. The way they talk to you is military. You don't have your phone because you're working with classified and, that level of secret stuff, right? There's sometimes no windows, depending where you're at, right? Then you're behind on talking to your family. You can't see your loved ones. You're too busy to go off base and get a life. And then a lot of times you're stuck rooming in barracks with people you don't like. So then you have that on top of it. A lot of people develop alcohol problems. In fact, that base is one of the #1 alcohol-related incident spots in America, as far as the military goes. We had a giant sign outside the building that said days alcohol-free, days since last alcohol-related incident. And it seldom made it to double digits. Typically every 2 or 3 days, it would be reset from alcohol-related incidents, meaning DUIs, caught on base, heavily intoxicated, fights started out because you drank, get in trouble at bars downtown, all that stuff. And so, yeah, that was I don't remember what the original question was, but that's how the nuke school kind of it needs reform. It needs huge
Yeah,
reform.
no question. That's astounding, man. That's astounding that people feel compelled to stay in that environment, and then they go out, through suicide, as opposed to say, what, discharge me. I don't want to do this anymore. It's amazing that all those different stresses you name, and that's incredible, man.
I like to
In
say
your time doing a couple of new,
there are some factors related to, again, I know a lot of sailors are too ashamed to leave. That there is this stigma that if you leave the military for anything other than a physical combat injury, that you will be outcasted from society, from especially your family. And so I feel like a lot of people felt like they couldn't leave. They were trapped, and death was the only way out,
Yeah.
unless they got physically injured. So that's one of the things to think about too.
Yeah, that's fair too. That's fair. What would you say in your time doing a couple of nukes, your most impactful episode you ever done, and
So
why?
my most popular episode, I would relate to as my most impactful episode as well, on par with another one. So Gen Z suicide prevention through the integration of faith and social media. That was one that until recently was listened to every single day, at least once by someone. And that was about, reaching people with the faith through social media to prevent suicide. And for me, that was a really powerful episode just because it is important, utilizing social media, combining and leveraging it with faith-based platforms, especially having faith-based suicide prevention, but in general, just being able to reach Gen Z people who have very different views on faith than older generations, on social media than older generations, but using both of them to prevent that. However, I will say, while that has had a broad reach, sometimes our most impactful episodes are just they reach one person, but it's the right person. And so I did an episode on being underweight as a man and woman, and feeling outcasted, neglected because of the idea, especially for women, that skinny is beautiful, therefore be quiet, and how underweight women are often end up developing eating disorders or self-esteem issues, or are brushed aside by the focus on the heavier set people, and how their health can be basically neglected and endangered because of that. And I actually had a young woman in Malaysia write out to my guest who shared it with me that she felt outcasted and unheard until that episode, that she always felt brushed aside. It was like, well, you're skinny, therefore you're fit or healthy, which is not equivalent. And therefore, just like be pretty and be quiet. And but our episode reached her, and she felt like heard about and like inspired to go on a fitness journey, and to be more confident. And so having her write in that message about that episode impacting her, saying she never felt heard until then, to me that has been my most impactful episode, because that's the exact audience I want to reach, is especially people who are outcasted and feel alone, and they hear my story or a guest story or a conversation like this, and they take something away from it, even if it's just a small confidence boost, or maybe it's something they implement into their lives daily that changes it. um, that's really important to me. And so I would say those two are key examples of some of the impact we can have on both a broad scale and then a small scale. But that small scale is just the beginning of a chain of effect. I believe that, that young woman may now, maybe she's going to raise her kids a little differently and help them with their weight when they grow up, or maybe some of her friends who are struggling, or she'll find people who were in her situation. So I think that's really important to do that, just as like our conversation might inspire someone to start their own podcast where they have similar conversations and they share their story, and then they reach hundreds or thousands of people, or the right person at the right time.
No, I love that. I love that. We probably don't have enough time to get into that. I only have room, have more questions, but we don't have room for it anymore. But my next to last question, I want to get into the Gen Z, Gen A frustration that you and I discussed in our pre-interview chat. We talked about the hate culture in the comment section. We talked about the destruction of the attention span, even the things we see on social where the entertainment
Right.
most popular is the one the least wholesome. So we talked about a lot of stuff in social media behavior as a whole. I don't want a long answer on this one because I know we don't have enough time for it. I only have one more question after this before we close out. But just love for you to kind of summarize, if you're speaking to somebody who's in Gen Z, Gen A, who are dealing with these same areas, or they're even maybe a part of it, maybe a part of that culture that we've been talking about in our offline discussions. How would you speak to them? How would you encourage them if you had a chance to speak to them now? What would you say to them?
That's good. I think the destruction of the attention span, I think, is the biggest issue. you know and you look at how we invest our time. And it's like we have time to spend so many people. I'm scared to even look at the statistics. If you looked at how much time people spend on social media, on content that goes nowhere, that is just that temporary dopamine hit, it's ridiculous. And then you look at how much time are people willing to spend to pray, to have dinner with their family, to go to social outings, or to learn, and it's ridiculous. If people spent as much time as they did on social media reading books and learning and writing and working on world problems, we could have a lot more done. But people just want to be entertained. They want to escape, and it's scary. I've been watching a lot of studies on AI and the decline of human social skills, of the continual division built by glass screens, but there's also the good of it. Like you and I having this conversation right now, right? It's all about how we use it. And I think that people forget the brevity of life, that there is a season for all things, and that the end of life is death. And I think that people have really taken that for granted, because they lose all concept of time and life in these virtual worlds, and they forget about the world around them, and then they're just wasting away. You know, I saw a clip this morning of David Goggins saying you're going to be 79, 80 years old in your hospital bed, and you're going to say to yourself, man, I should have done so much more with my life. And I never want that. I want to be, 80 in my hospital bed and I said, whew, I did way too much. I maybe I should have taken another beach day or two, because that is a much better regret to have than saying, man, I spent so much time scrolling on social media and it contributed nothing to my life or to anyone's life. I think it's a very selfish thing. I think it's so selfish, this declining attention span, this time spent online, this indulgement in immorality and unwholesome content. And it's funny because so many people are talking about how they want unity. They want, all people of all genders and races to be equal and work together and live in peace. Yet everything they do just perpetuates division, So I think it's just everyone has their values wrong. But when you look at it, what's being instilled in them? I mean, babies, newborns, infants, and toddlers are being given iPads and phones by parents, uh, and not always under control, regulation, or at all. Sometimes just out of neglect, they are just being thrown
Fair.
into the social media void. Um, I don't think that's I can't really criticize. I don't want to criticize other parents, but I think if you're doing it as a way to just redirect your child from you, I think they're growing up into this world. They're
Yeah.
being taught. What if instead of iPads and phones, we gave our kids, books and books that taught values and education and what matters? What if instead of iPads, they were given family dinner and social outings like we used to have, and in a way that was fruitful? I just think it's a very destructive, selfish path that everyone's going down.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, man. Final question for you. Yeah, up against the clock here. Well, final question. I asked this for all of our guests. You're not going to be exempt today. You got to answer it too. If you're not working in your current capacity, you're not podcasting a couple of nukes, you're not writing books, you're not speaking, you're not doing any comedy, none of those things are taking place, not even in the Navy. What is Mr. Whiskey doing with his life if he's not doing any of those things?
My answer to this, I really want to answer it the way Luke Combs answered it in his song. I'd still be doing this, even if it wasn't paid, even if I didn't reach the right people. Because I remember he said, even if he wasn't on stage, this country star, he'd be at a bar playing his guitar. And, I think that's the same thing. I think even if I didn't have a podcast, even if I didn't have my books or comedy, I would still be out there with people having these conversations, just no microphone, no camera, just out there making connections. Maybe
and no job either, Mr. Whiskey?
And if I had no job, I just
I can't let you do that, Mr. Whiskey. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Everything you shared about us with your family and everything, there's no way you're gonna be walking around without a job. So there's some kind of vocation. You're gonna be doing something. I don't care if you're making firewood, you're doing something. What are you doing?
It'd probably be waitering because it's
Okay.
flexible schedule, big money, and social interaction. You know, I I I because I think it's just I'm not a big fan of the blue collar industry in the sense that I've worked at chemical plants, railroad tracks, in the military, and
Gotcha.
I know that I don't like rotating shift work. I don't like the very ingrained leadership styles of the blue collar industries, at least at the places I've been. Um, so probably waitering. And if I could do dog sitting on the side,
Okay.
I love my dog. I'm a proud dog dad. So if I could do that stuff for sure,
Okay. No worries.
making
This has
impacts
been
in
great.
small ways.
This has been great, brother. Thank you so much. For all you guys viewing and listening, thank you. This has been fantastic. Mr. Whiskey has a podcast, a great podcast, by the way, a couple of news. Talks about mental health, military life and culture, religion and faith. Talks to the Gen Z and Gen A in regards to social media behavior. And he talks very strongly about addiction and recovery. So if you like what you heard today on an episode, check out his podcast, a couple of news. I'm sure he's open to hear from you guys if you have questions or comments about his work or about what he's going through. By all means, please hit him up. Mr. Whiskey, once we get out of here, if you don't mind jumping onto our YouTube channel and in the comments section, drop any links you have where people can reach out to you. You can your social media links where they can reach out to you and DM you and whatever, however you want it to be done. So they can kind of hit you up with those questions and comments they may have for you, man. If you're okay with that.
Yes, sir. Always.
Good. Awesome. Thanks again for watching and listening, everybody. Of course, you can find us on social media across the board. Our website, they call me MrU.buzzsprout.com, will give you access to all of our social media links. And of course, you'll find Mr. Whiskey's links in all those areas and episodes where they have gone live now, or of course on the replay, or in the comments section on our YouTube channel under this episode for today. So thanks again for watching and listening. Have a fantastic day. Mr. Whiskey and Mr. U, we're both out here. Have a great day.